Thanks. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks Red and May for having me again. It's great to be here, and thanks Beverly. And just for those of you who are looking for a thread connecting the two books we're talking about this afternoon, I actually cite the exact same passage from Volume 3 about the labor relation being the hidden edifice in which the entire form of sovereignty is based upon. Although I don't do justice to Volume 3 in the way that she does, but I take that as a kind of provocation and another way of thinking about some of the same base superstructure problems. So I want to say a little bit about the book and what I'm trying to do with it, and then we'll talk back and forth and then turn it over to some discussion. This book, like all things, is overdetermined. There are multiple things trying to do at once, maybe too many. And I'm going to say a couple of things about some of the provocations that brought the book to light. The most general one, of course, is the Spinoza-Marx relation, which is getting a lot of attention. In fact, there was a previous event with Red May with Nick Nesbitt and his book. And there are lots of different ways to think about the Marx-Spinoza relation. One is the influence. Marx copied passages from Spinoza in his notebooks. The other is, kind of the way in which they might, without influence, kind of be dealing with some overlapping ideas having to do with determination, causality, maybe even materiality as well. And then I think there's a third way, and I kind of touch on all of these a little bit. And the third way is kind of the not so much Spinoza influence on Marx or the intersection of Spinoza and Marx, but the way in which maybe by their very differences complement each other and offer things theoretically that each need. Many people point out that Spinoza offers a rich understanding of the imaginative and affective dimension of subjectivity, which in turn allows for, and then Marx, of course, offers a more historical understanding of social relations, and the two together offer some way to maybe make sense of the world. And in some sense, that latter is the one I'm strongly aligned with, but the specific problem I decided to take on was the relationship to work, which might seem strange and kind of idiosyncratic, but it seems to me, one of the things that many people have focused on in thinking about Spinoza as a sort of proto-thinker of a kind of field of ideology, right? Spinoza, quite famously in the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, framed the question of ideology in this sense of why do people fight for servitude as if it was salvation. And the way in which he emphasizes not just the sort of passive endurance of ideas, in some theories of ideology, these ideas kind of come in and you passively endure them, but you actively strive for them. And it seemed to me that the historical and political provocation that I wanted to think through is, as many people, and I'm talking to Red May, so I don't need to explain this, is many people have pointed out that, you had that famous, often repeated graph of understanding the relationship between productivity and compensation as work has gotten worse and worse in terms of offering less and less in terms of pay, stability, security, and so on. One of the strange things we've seen, especially in the US, but other countries as well, is not so much an increased contestation over the demand of work, but a sort of doubling down on work itself, resolving the problems and limitations of work by working harder, whether it be taking on a gig economy job to add to your regular job, or the hustle mindset, or whatever. And it seemed to me that sort of phenomena was another version of why do people fight for their servitude as if it was salvation. And the other thing I think I wanted to do in bringing Marx and Spinoza together, and this is back that second aspect, the commonalities between the two. One of the things I think is very interesting about Spinoza and Marx as philosophers is, of course, as philosophers, they had their philosophical arguments with other philosophers, as philosophers tend to. Marx had a lot of them and got really into them in times. But the thing that I think both of them have in common, it shows up in their strongest works, like in the Ethics, in the Theological Treatise, and in Capital, is their real attempt to understand that the true struggle of philosophy should not to be to have little battles with other philosophers, but to make sense of the kind of spontaneous philosophy that's at work in and through our social structures. I mean, of course, for Spinoza, this had more to do with religion and the sort of, and beyond that, the sort of almost kind of hardwired in tendency to see ourselves as a kingdom within a kingdom, to see ourselves as separate from nature. And of course, Marx offered more historical understandings. But I think for both of them, the thing that I find really interesting is that philosophy's task is to make sense of the way in which there's a dominant conception of things that's at work, produced in and through institutions, practices, our strivings, and so on. And the task of philosophy is to sort of unravel and problematize that, and to ultimately begin to think about all the ways in which we're determined by a particular way of living, so we can transform that. So that's in very broad strokes what I'm trying to do with the book.
Great. Okay. This is working, right? No. Or yes. Oh, do I have to flip the thing? Yes. Excellent. Okay. Good. Good. I can hear it. Thanks. So I wanted to, as a way of starting the conversation, first focus on. I think in Jason's book I see there as being three streams that don't intuitively go together, as Jason was already saying, and I wanted to I wanted to ask questions about each of them, and then really how they fit together. The first stream, as you mostly said there, was about the relationship between Marx and Spinoza, their intersecting methodological and philosophical foundations. The second is about the critique of work and work culture, the ideology of work, in part as a constant source and reproduction of what you call negative solidarity, which you're going to have to explain a little bit more, but goes along with that question about striving for our servitude as if it were for our salvation. So that's the second. The first, Marx and Spinoza, a very philosophical stream of the book. The second, I would say, a contemporary and immediately political one about our attachments to work, the imposition of work, the necessity of work, etc. And then third in the book, which you didn't mention at all yet, which is really about contemporary films and the representation of work in those films. So let me ask one question about each of those and then a bonus question, and then you can see which ones you want to work with first. So regarding Marx and Spinoza, I think it would be helpful to work out, I guess I have my own ideas about this, but I'd like to see how you would do a first pass at what is it that Spinoza and the introduction of Spinoza did for Marxist studies. Like, what is it about Spinoza that allowed for a kind of opening in Marxist studies? You could even think about it if you wanted to historically. What is it about authors, especially in the 1960s and 70s, mostly European scholars, it seems to me, like, why is it that Spinoza allowed them to see Marx differently, and what is it about Spinoza that did that? So that's maybe the philosophical question. The second one about work, you don't need to write this down, do you? No, you'll remember. Okay, you're good. I was going to offer the paper. The second one is about the critique of work, and I think the critique of work in the book is clear and important. The one thing I wanted to ask in addition to that, as you were already outlining, and I think that's something, as you say, that experientially we all understand that, and things, is that I would want, I was hoping you could talk about a next step, like to propose what to do about it. Or maybe I'm wrong to ask that. Like, what would the abolition of work look like? Or is the abolition of work the wrong way of thinking about how to address the servitude that work imposes on us? Mm-hmm. Or so maybe just pose it a different way, the way you had done this already. If we in general are forced to treat work, which is our servitude, as if it were our salvation, what would be? I'm totally on board with the diagnosis. Mm-hmm. What then is the prescription, if we're talking medical terms? The third is about the films themselves, and maybe you should say a little bit more about the films. And I'm wondering what the status of the films are in the text. Like, are they illustrations of philosophical and political analyses? Are they themselves producers of ideas and concepts in a way that is inaccessible to other texts? Do the films do something and tell us something about work that we can't access in a philosophical or political register?
Mm-hmm.
And then fourth thing, this is the bonus question. I hope those have made sense so far. The fourth is that one of the things, this is about Jason's work in general and about this work, also in particular maybe, is that I feel like Jason in recent years has been constructing a new version of French theory. Like the era of what the so-called French theory is now past. That we understand. That if we put together, like starting from the 1960s, there was this construction of the U.S. of, essentially Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, perhaps a few other authors, and that, and it's often been said that the era of grandmasters is over, for better, for worse, in many ways for better. But if you follow the footnotes and the references within the text, Jason's referring to a new generation of French authors, and in his own translation work, is introducing them. Ones that I think many people don't know very well: Frank Fischbach, Yves Citon, Frédéric Lordon, there are others. And so I guess I was wondering if you could say something about the status of and maybe the importance for you, of a contemporary circuit of French intellectual intervention, perhaps about Marx and Spinoza, but maybe more generally, because I feel like even though you don't present it this way, like I said, I think that you are proposing for English language readers a paradigm of new French thought that is valuable for and contributes something new for English language readers. Those are my four.
Okay, yeah, that's good. So, so the first one, what does Spinoza offer? I mean, to me, I'm going to make a little more of a historical claim than I do in the book. That it seems quite striking that, and there's been an interest in Marxist circles in Spinoza. You find it in early Soviet thought, but the part that I'm working on, a lot of it starts in and around 68. You get Deleuze's book, Matterhorn's book. You get Althusser does his piece on ideology, which borrows heavily from Spinoza's appendix to part one of the Ethics. And it seems to me that one of the threads going through there is this question of subjectivity and trying to understand subjectivity as something that is, and this is coming back to the first book, and a thing like maybe people have one problem they're always trying to think through, and I'm fine with that. The dual nature of subjectivity in capital is constantly producing subjectivity, but it's constantly relying on this double sense of the genitive, the production of subjectivity in terms of how subjectivity produces commodities and so on, right? And the emphasis there, of course, is that something begins to happen. And of course, the periodizations around this are always kind of difficult to pin down, where it begins to involve, this productive subjectivity begins to involve more than just using your body to transform things, but using your ability to think, to affect, to engage. And when you hire workers, and the goal is to make these workers not just people toiling away, sort of behind the scenes, but working in the front of a store or engaging, through forms of communication and so on. You're engaging more of their subjective developments, which means you have to have more control over them, right? How they desire, how they think. In other words, contemporary capitalism doesn't just need workers; it needs enthusiastic workers, right? And so, for Spinoza, this idea of the maintenance and the reproduction of striving is how to understand sort of everything. Which then, to jump from there to the second question about work, and the the diagnosis and the prescription. It seems to me, I mean, while I was working on this book, I was working with some students who were involved in a project in Maine, Portland, Maine, where I live, which was to pass new legislation around minimum wage, which would include legislation that would eliminate the tipped minimum wage, right? And make it so that restaurant workers had to be paid the same minimum. And there was a lot of resistance to this on the part of restaurant workers, and especially front of house restaurant workers, for whom the tip seemed like, and we talked about this a lot with these students who are working on this, and the formulation that I came to in talking about them was, you can't, if you're going to take away someone's strategy for how to maximize their ability to make a living for themselves in this world, you have to offer them another strategy. And I think part of what I'm trying to diagnose in the book, and part of what I mean by negative solidarity, is that there has been simultaneous sort of destruction of other ways of imagining strategies of how to improve our lives, so that work is the only strategy left for us. And it's not just work, but it's work understood in a highly individualistic and isolated way. Like, I'm going to be a better worker. And because of that sort of, which is, I mean, one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is think of that strategy as both something that is produced institutionally, materially, right? I mean, this is something that obviously Marx thought a lot about, is that, that a big part of how you produce workers, that famous line from the end of Capital, that the capitalist mode of production needs workers who treat its requirements as self-evident natural laws, that part of what you do, of course, is you just simply eliminate any other possibilities for how people can reproduce their lives, right? You have to sell our wage labor in order to live. There aren't other resources out there. The commons have been destroyed. There aren't other possibilities. So there's a way in which that is to call that ideological. And this is something that is being debated a lot. Soren Mao's book, Mute Compulsion. The sense that, like, is that ideology? Is it the simple lack of an alternative? Is that just the way in which a material condition becomes sort of adapted? And I think that's a component. And I think one of the things I think is interesting, and find this both in Spinoza and Marx, is the way in which both of them are struggling with a way in which a particular way of living automatically produces a particular way of thinking. But it's not, the interesting thing for me is it's not sufficient, right? I mean, one of the strangest things about capitalism as a mode of production is it's not satisfied to simply be mute compulsion of economic relations. It demands a kind of ideological or cultural, it's Frederick Lodon has this line where he says, we don't just live in a capitalist economy, we live in a capitalist society, a capitalist culture, right? It demands a kind of cultural dimension as well. So along with that, that material condition which produces a particular way of thinking is a kind of entire ideological superstructure which tells us that, work is not just what we have to do, it's what we should do, it defines who we are. I mean, you think about the question when you ask someone this question, which is, this very commonplace question you get asked all the time, what do you do for a living, right? It's a multi-layer question, because on the one hand, it's like, where are you in the economic hierarchy of life? How seriously should I take you, etc.? It's a question about how you're situated, but it's also a question of, like, who do you take yourself to be? Who are you? What do you desire? What do you want to be? It's both material and sort of aspirational at the same time. And of course, for me, and this is I think one of the great things about Spinoza as a resource he offers is his ability to simultaneously say, right, that ideas and things are just two different ways of grasping the same thing, that they're absolutely identical, that the two levels of that question are really just two versions of the same question. But at the same time, Spinoza also insists that only bodies can determine bodies, only ideas can determine bodies. There is a way in which the two things have to be thought both in their identity and their separation. And I think, and this is, I'll go to the next part about popular culture in this as well. I mean, one of the things that interests me about thinking about representations of work in popular culture, two things about it. One is once you get past the sort of, the usual way of thinking about work in popular culture would be this sense that, the last thing people want to do when they watch TV or watch a movie is think about work, right? This sort of escapist philosophy, which explains a lot, and but then once you get past that, you begin to see how work is everywhere in popular culture, and it is everywhere in a profoundly contradictory or ambivalent sort of way. In that, to take one text that I talk about in the book, the television series Breaking Bad and its spin-off Better Call Saul, right? Which is the premise of that, a high school chemistry teacher finds out that he has lung cancer and begins to worry that his job and the insurance that comes with his job is not going to provide for his family's well-being. So he tries to hatch. So on the one hand, it is kind of a critique of work. It's a critique of the idea that work doesn't provide the necessary conditions of our existence. But at the same time, what does he do? Well, he decides to become a dealer of crystal meth, and he becomes almost this fantasy figure because he's really good at it, right? So it's both a critique of work, and it's also addresses the core kind of fantasy around work today, which is, if I could be the smartest possible employee on my own, I'm not going to engage with other people collectively, I'm not going to engage in solidarity, I'm going to be the best possible employee, I will in some sense turn that servitude to salvation, to my own condition of my own autonomy. So the ambivalence about work is there. And I also think one of the other things I think is interesting is the way in which sometimes films and TV engage with, in a more immediate way, some of the limitations of some of our imagination of critical perspectives around work. Like, to take one example, it's pretty well known, David Graeber's book, Bullshit Jobs, right? And for part of David Graeber's argument of what makes a bullshit job terrible is the sense that, as he says, the employee doing it doesn't even think the job should exist and has to pretend that it should exist as part of their condition for work. But which is, I think, an interesting, on some sort of affective level, it's an interesting critique, but it ends up producing this idea that, which I find highly suspect, that there's some kind of, like, if your job was useful, right? If you're cleaning up garbage because someone has to clean up the garbage, you get some sort of satisfaction from that. And to me, reading a text like Graeber's critique Bullshit Jobs, along with a very kind of, well, for a time being, was a very resonated with a lot of students. Students were talking about it. A film like Fight Club, and Fight Club has a similar kind of sense of what makes jobs terrible is their bullshit nature, right? If we were working for our survival, it would mean something more. And I find that claim to be just, to be suspect on some level, and to be, I'm not sure that people producing goods and services that are unquestionably, I agree that part of, you see this in some of the literature about why it's so difficult to do things like organize workers in a call center is because at the end of the day, what's a rational existence of a call center is it shouldn't exist, right? there shouldn't be cold calling people to sell products. And all the workers there know that. I find that aspect of the critique I totally agree with. But the other aspect, that there is some kind of sense of meaning that comes from doing something useful, I'm a little more critical of. Though I do think, and this is where I'm kind of both like distancing myself from a particular sort of hardcore anti-work stance, in the sense of, we just, it'd be great if machines did everything and we could just, be lazy and play around. I do think that people, the desire to want to engage with something, to do something, to affect and transform one's own position in the world and the world in some sense. I do think that's an important desire. I'm not going to say it's like necessary or natural, but I do think we have to take seriously the way in which work, wage labor, has in some sense hijacked that desire. And I do think that sometimes, it's precisely the way that popular culture has to, in some sense, it's a very Althuserian reading, and it's the imaginary relation to our real conditions of existence. The way that popular culture has to both kind of gesture towards our criticisms of work, but then ultimately try and recuperate them into a vision, and are constantly of work, and are constantly drawn into this problem of separating out good work from bad work. The way in which in representations of work, there's usually one particular job that stands in for what is problematic about all jobs. Right? Sometimes it's the job of, say, the office drone in a cubicle that becomes synonymous with everything that's wrong with work, and sometimes it's the another film that's very popular about work, Office Space, right? It's the waitress, right? And it's the demand. If you've seen the film, everyone kind of remembers the demand to express yourself through flair, the demand of affective labor that's required of everyone. And so film, in representing work, constantly reminds us that the critique of work has to go beyond juxtaposing good images of jobs and bad images of jobs. So then the last point, which I think is interesting, for me, about French theory and theory in general, I guess I would say that, and I agree that to some extent, if you've been around like philosophy and theory circles for long enough, I guess I can now say I have been long enough, there's this process by which a new kind of master thinker is brought about and translated and brought out to the made visible, and sometimes they give a talk at SPEP and everything else. And I think there's a certain sense in which you could argue that sequence has exhausted itself, but I think what I find interesting about that, and what I try to sort of place myself in relation to, I've always been, in some sense, drawn to theoretical practices and theoretical situations which were more collective than individualistic, right? And I find this in various strains of the Marxist tradition. I find this, the Althuserians, in their heyday, 65 and reading Capital, they were kind of like, oh, you say this thing about structural causality, now I'm going to say something about it too, and sort of working off it. Same thing. I know this is something you know much better than I do in the post-autonomous tradition, right? Virno would use the word multitude, and Negri would use the multitude, but they use it in different but related ways. I find this similar in the Spinoza circles, where someone will think about something in a particular way about imagination or affect, and then someone else will take it and work with it. And to me, I guess the good news about the end of a certain kind of theory, driven by the sort of what's hot, what's not master thinker, is that maybe now we can think about theory as a kind of collective practice in which a concept produced by one thinker becomes useful for another, and and in that way, the one takeaway point that a lot of people have said, oh, that was a really interesting thing about the book, is this term negative solidarity, which I make absolutely clear I did not come up with. Right? Alex Williams came up with it. I feel a little awkward. We were supposed to get together for a drink last November when I was in London, because and I want to say, look, I give you credit for this. And what is negative solidarity? As he puts it, negative solidarity is, my best way of putting it is, this bumper sticker which you sometimes see, work harder, millions of welfare depend upon it, right? And it's a solidarity, right? Because it does in some sense address and interpolate everyone who sees these bumper stickers. We're all workers. But it's a negative solidarity. It's also a fictitious solidarity because you don't really understand what has happened to aid for dependent families with dependent children. Everything that's happened in the restructuring of welfare in this country. If you really believe there are people living, like the famous figure of the welfare queen and so on. But it is a form of solidarity that can only operate in an antagonistic and downward way. Right? It looks at people who have some kind of positive dimension of their working existence. But that positive dimension is something like protection from arbitrary firings through collective bargaining, or if it's a positive dimension of, this is something that I do agree with David Graeber about, the resentment that is felt towards people who are able to, the resentment sometimes felt towards things like school teachers and so on, because they get to do something meaningful, right? If you have a positive dimension to your working existence, that is not seen as something that, hey, we all should have. We all should have work that is meaningful, work that provides for our material conditions, that has security. It is seen as something which is questionable and suspect, and the ideal that is sort of the negative ideal that's produced from this is this ideal of work is valorized precisely because it sucks, it's terrible, and my ability to endure this terrible work gives me some kind of social standing, right? And this is, I think there's this very ambivalent phrase in Spinoza where he talks about, we strive as much as we can to think about things that increase our capacity to act. And I think the ambivalence is, because Spinoza is constantly pointing out that when Spinoza talks about the affective dimension of thought and striving, is that we're often mistaken about what it is that increases our joy, right? We sometimes think that, when you're drinking, you think that alcohol is like the possibility of your joy. It's making you, I'm having such a great time and so on. The morning after, you think about it fundamentally differently, and you see it as a source of your pain and your suffering because you can't understand why your head hurts so much, and so on. We often are, for Spinoza, an inadequate idea is an idea which does not adequately express or understand its causality, but they have a causal relation too. Right? There's a reason why I'm mistaken about what I'm mistaken. There are causal conditions which have produced it, and I think, to some extent, we could say this about work, right? In a situation in which the possibility of employment that is gainful, that is rewarding, and so on, is increasingly foreclosed, there's a tendency to turn the negatives of work itself into something that are valorized. Look at me, I work hard, I don't complain, and this has given my life some kind of meaning. And there's very interesting, I'm not just saying this speculatively, there's very interesting, ethnographic and sociological studies about this. One book I draw on, Jennifer Silva's book, Coming Up Short, which she looked at working class families in the post-2008 recession and looked at people who really have everything that they've tried to do with work has failed them, right? They have, and what is interesting about them is they're these people she talks to, she expects some kind of anger, frustration, but their overall response is, I just have to work harder and I can make this work, right? Their response to the failures of wage labor to produce what wage labor has promised. These are people who are not, a lot of them are like have moved back home with their parents, they're young people. Everything about work has failed them, yet they, in some sense, have not given up on the sense that work provides structure and meaning for their existence. And this is, like I said, I think that the positive, the prescriptive thing I'm trying to, if I was to continue with this, and someone said to me after reading the book, it's like, oh, you wrote like a modern Spinoza's ethics for work, but you didn't write part 5. And I was like, yeah, but part 5 has a lot of problems. Anyone who reads Spinoza knows part 5 of the ethics has a lot of problems. But part of me was like, yeah, but I also think that part 5s can only be written in and through political practices. I'm not sure if they can be written speculatively. And I should say that in the midst of all this, I was writing all this, during the peak sort of COVID shutdowns and so on, and rewriting this. And I constantly didn't know what to do with the conjuncture I was working through. And part of it was like, I just wanted to write to escape thinking about the fact that, suddenly I was like, oh, I can't go out in the world because I might die. Or I'm like constantly arguing with my parents, like, Mom, Dad, don't go out to places anymore. You're like, you gotta stay home. I was writing to escape, constellation of philosophy. But I never quite knew what to do with what was happening. But, in the midst of all this, it did seem like there was a reimagining, in the so-called Great Resignation, or the turn to some kind to more union organizing and so on, that it did seem like something was happening about our affective and imaginative relation to work. I mean, on the one hand, because it was being severed, like suddenly this thing that everyone said was impossible, for a brief moment, right? People were able to get the material conditions for their existence without work, that one check that people got. And at the same time, work itself was suddenly looking very threatening to a lot of people, right? That you could die or get very sick. And so even though I was not talking about what's happening at the moment with our affective and imaginative relation to work, it did seem that something profound was happening, although the big question is, and this is the question I'm still struggling with, is how do you sustain that, right? How do you sustain a transformative relationship to work when work as it exists, as wage labor that is highly individualized in the way in which it is organized? How do you sustain a transformation of our relation to work? In and through, at the same time, we have to continue to work in this world as we're trying to transform it.
Can I go through back with one more? Who am I looking to? Should I look to Philip for a confirmation? Or should we go, Mahim, that's best. Okay, so I have a couple, I just had a couple back things to go back, and then maybe we could open it up after that. One is they're rather separated, because some of the different things you said were separated. I like very much your response about the French theory thing. In some ways, that you're posing a beneficial transition from this notion of the master thinker, and especially the master thinker who owns concepts, like you say, différence, so that's Derrida, or discipline, or dispositif, oh, that's Foucault. They own these concepts. Rather, you're saying like you're both saying minor thinkers, which I like that idea too, and collective production of concepts. That's, so that there isn't an ownership of concepts, but they're collective working out. I think that's really great, and perhaps that's true. I also wanted just to underline. I think it's really great the work you're doing, both here and in translation things, about introducing thinkers that I don't know, that we wouldn't get to see otherwise. Okay, I have a reaction that moves across this Spinoza and work thing, which is that one could get the impression from what you're saying that we're totally trapped and it's inescapable. So that we think, so this is, I guess there are two levels of this. Like, one is that it seems to me that one of your focuses on Spinoza's notion of the affects and the way that the affects function, you were putting in the context of subjectivity, is primarily ones in which we think we are acting in our own benefit, but it turns out that we're not. Mm-hmm. And that resonates with the way you're talking about work, that primarily you're focusing on instances in which people think that they're developing a relationship to work or striving for a different relationship to work that's going to get them out of the dilemma we have of terrible work or terrible life based on work, etc. But that it turns out not to be true, and it turns out to re-enslave us. And so I guess what I'm wondering about with that is if there isn't a mode of escape. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm not totally satisfied with the way you said about anti-work and the notion of the refusal of work, because anti-work politics and the refusal of work are not about just sitting on the couch. It's what is the refusal of is the refusal of command, which it's implicit in the wage relationship. It's a refusal of the unfreedom of the work relationship as it's constructed in capital. And that seems to me different, allowing for a different kind of practical activity in the world that's not, that is free in some sense, or uncommanded, or that we have a certain kind of autonomy over. I mean, you said that can't be done in speculative form, like in the philosophical work. It has to be done in practice. But certainly one could point to many, both historical and contemporary, practical efforts that are moving in this direction, or proposals that move in this direction. You mentioned briefly like basic income or something like that. I mean, these are at least ways in which people have tried to, in recent years, tried to do that. And I guess I'm wondering with all that, how much, or if I'm misinterpreting a kind of the way that your focus is ending up in a kind of inescapable cycle. Mm-hmm. And so you could put it back in the philosophical terms, like, are there how would we, like you could say, okay, what would Spinoza say? Like with the old Jesus thing. What would Spinoza do? He would, in what ways are the affects, even though we are mostly determined by outside forces, and therefore mostly we're dominated by sad passions, and mostly we're determined by inadequate ideas, and yet there is a path to salvation sometimes through the imagination, as you say, etc. So anyway, I guess I'm looking for that. So this one comparison that helps for me, and I'm not sure if it would help for you, but you do mention several times in the book, just at least the concept of Lauren Berlant's book about cruel optimism, and there I see the resonances with cruel optimism. So Lauren says, that there are what defines cruel optimism is our attachment to and desires for something that turns out to thwart us. So that it has and she wrote this, during the Obama era, where it seemed like that desire for Obama was exactly the kind of thing that was thwarting that was one of her examples. But anyway, there are a number of others. But then in the course of the book, she does, like you go towards, film and cultural objects, and she develops ideas like lateral agency. You know, like we're not sovereign subjects, he says, which you would, it seems like a very Spinozist idea to me. But she says we nonetheless develop what she calls lateral agency, which I would call like a non-sovereign agency. Like there are ways in which we, in this current contemporary capitalist society, people nonetheless find ways of, within margins, creating forms of autonomy, forms of freedom, etc. And I guess I was wondering where that would go, you know, if there's a way of thinking about that from where you are.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe, I mean, an adequate response to me would be just like, you know, Michael, that's a very nice idea, but that's not my project.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess, I too think a lot about this, you know, this sort of way of thinking that, you know, what we do is structured by what we imagine is possible. What we imagine is possible is structured by how we live. So then, how do you break that, right? There's this telling line, as something that Lordon, you know, points out that at the end of part 3 of the Ethics, you know, when Spinoza is giving his outline of all the different definitions of the affects, and they're given in terms of these binaries, right? There's joy, sadness, there's love, hate, etc. He gets to one that he can't give of an opposite to. He says there's overestimating oneself, but there is no underestimating oneself, because what you imagine you cannot do, right? And he ends up sort of saying that there's a sense in which if you don't think you can do something, well, it becomes, as you know, the self-help term for this is self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And I think that's an interesting, you know, moment in Spinoza. But I do think that there is the way out of this for me that I want to think about is the way in which how we are affected by something and how we imagine something don't always line up, right? And one of the things I think is very interesting, and reading this along some of the sort of ethnographic and other discussions of work, is, you know, one of the things that comes up again and again is like almost no one really wants to talk about, like, it's what's absent from our cultural and pop culture representations of work is just like things like the absolute exhaustion at the end of a day, and things like there's a way in which that doesn't get represented, right? And so there is a sense in which for me, if there's a way out of this circle, it's in the way in which imagination, affect, and understanding, while they're produced, the sense in which there's something like a dominant ideology, would be the way in which they all supposedly line up with one another. How you imagine things, how you feel about things, how you think about things, are all kind of in a row. But I think that the way we actually live is that those things are constantly in tension with one another. And those tensions open the possibility of where someone has to say, look, this thing I'm supposed to be doing does have great meaning and purpose, it actually sucks and it's killing me. Or it's actually really meaningful to me, but its meaningfulness and purpose is absolutely opposed to the way in which it's organized, right? And you know, as you were saying about, and that way I do agree with, you know, for me the true kernel of a kind of anti-work politics is not, I don't want to do anything, but I want to do something, and work itself, the way it's structured, commanded, and obedience, is actually antithetical to what I want to do. Right? This comes up in you know, I think Sarah Ferris's book about Work Won't Love You Back. She's pretty clear that like people who are lucky enough that they're doing the thing that they really want to do ultimately come to the same kind of conclusion, that it's she's talking about teachers, artists, etc. It's its structure as work that is ultimately opposed to the thing that they actually want to do. And so it's that, I know I was being kind of glib with the sitting on the couch thing, but like it's that to me is the real kernel of anti-work politics, is a sense that that to do something, and I know I'm using a very vague language to do something, but that work becomes destructive of the very thing that it's supposed to be doing.
Let me try one other thing,
Sure.
and then I'll stop, and we can open up in it, which is I just thought it might. Well, it's just another way of posing the same question, I think. Which is that at least in my my Marx version, the starting point for liberation always comes from within.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That the proletariat's really within capital, is created by capital, exists within capital, but within is the greatest force of destruction of it and the construction of something new. Or to put it in maybe more better terms, the better way to ask it is a line in the first part of the manifesto where Marx and Engels say that capital creates weapons for its own destruction. And what we have to do is find those weapons and utilize them. So it would seem to me that in this dynamic, because one of the things what do you call the structure that you keep pointing towards is one in which we are inevitably within. Mm-hmm. Like we think we're getting out, but we're in fact we're within. And so I guess maybe a potential could be to say, well, what are within this horrible and degrading social structure, what are the weapons that capital provides us with that we could wield differently against the work structure? I guess I'm not expecting you to have an answer to that, but that might be a framework for thinking.
I can answer it, right? Yeah, that is the question. I'm still thinking about it.